In this video, we're going to address something that I've been ashamed to admit as a woodworker. You see, I've been dabbling in woodworking for going on almost 10 years now, and sadly, this here is my personal collection of cutting boards. That's right. Every single one of them is plastic.
I know, right? It's so embarrassing.
Now these have been heavily used over the years, and some of that plastic is definitely starting to chip off. I'm not sure why it has taken us this long as a society to start recognizing that maybe ingesting all of this plastic isn't the best thing for us. Unless you've been living under a rock the past few years, then you've probably heard the word microplastics lately way more than you ever care to. So in this video, I'm going to take this battle against microplastics into my own hands by building a wooden end grain cutting board. Now, I have made countless cutting boards for other people over the years, but I think it's about time that I finally made one for myself. What do you say? Let's get started. To get started, I'm just cutting some 1 3/4 inch strips out of 2 of these walnut boards that I had already previously milled. I really didn't have any particular size in mind for this cutting board. The plan was to just use these 2 walnut boards and just see what that yielded me. Turns out I was able to get 8 1 3/4 inch strips from those walnut boards, so the next step was to go ahead and glue those together using some Titebond 3 wood glue. For this glue up, I'm just gluing the edges of the boards together. Once I had everything clamped together, I added a couple more clamps to the edges to try and keep everything flush with one another. I then tried to wipe away as much of the excess glue as possible and left this in clamps overnight. The next day, I removed the boards from clamps and worked on cutting it down once again using my crosscut sled on my table saw. I'll be cross-cutting 1 3/4 inch strips from the glued up board, making sure to keep these strips in order as I cut them. If you want to see how I built this very basic crosscut sled for my job site table saw, then I'll leave a link to that video in the description box for you to check out. I built this crosscut sled a couple of weeks ago, and I've used it so much since then that I'm kind of kicking myself for not building one sooner. Once all those strips were cut, I placed them in the clamps in the order that I cut them out, and I began the glue up process. This time I flipped the board so that the end grain is now facing up. I decided that I liked the pattern that was created when I offset the pieces a little bit rather than leaving them flush on the ends. So I just offset every other piece and worked on getting them lined up evenly. This doesn't have to be perfect because I will square up the board in a later step. Once I had the pattern like I wanted it, I clamped everything together, wiped away as much wood glue as I could, and left it to dry overnight. Now it's time to get this cutting board cleaned up and flat. Now since this is an end grain cutting board, it's a little risky to run through the planer, so you can either surface it with a router or use what I'm using here, a belt sander. Now my plan was to use my router at first, but luckily my board ended up being relatively flat after my last glue up, so I was able to flatten it out pretty quickly using just the belt sander. Next, I worked on getting the cutting board square. I just used my track saw for this step, and it made pretty quick work of it. I seriously love this Milwaukee track saw. It has been my favorite purchase in the past year. I find myself using it all of the time for different things. It was able to cut right through this almost 2-inch thick walnut in one pass, but since I like it so much and I want this thing to be around for a while, I decided to make the rest of the cuts in 2 passes just to make it a little easier on her. Next, I used a 1/4-inch roundover bit to round over the edges of the cutting board. I decided to add some finger holds to the side of the cutting board, so I cut these over on my router table using a large bowl and tray bit. I just marked some lines on the board to help guide me. Unfortunately, I experienced some major tear out when doing this step originally, which was pretty frustrating in the moment. I almost just cut this section off and scrapped the whole finger hold idea altogether, but I decided to give it another try, and fortunately I was able to cut the finger holds this time without any casualties. Once I had those finger hold grooves cut out, I worked on sanding them with this Milwaukee detail sander. I like using this tool for sanding things like this because it has a foam attachment that just makes sanding contours so much easier. As with any cutting board build, there is usually a lot of sanding involved. I won't bore you with all of that footage, but I started sanding here with 80 grit, and I will eventually work my way through the grits until I get to 320 grit, and I will stop there. Fun fact, I guess my camera was set on a slow motion recording setting here for the remainder of the footage for this video, which I didn't realize until I had filmed everything. Don't worry, I will speed up the footage for you, but it got me thinking, is watching someone sand in slow motion more entertaining? No. It's still very boring.
You can say that again.
My last sanding step is to water pop the piece to raise the wood fibers, and then once it's dry, I'll come back and sand the board one final time at 320 grit, knocking down any of those raised wood fibers. Now, some people might like to sand to a higher grit than that for cutting boards, but I found that I can't tell much difference after 320 grit. And to be honest, by the time I get to 320 grit, I don't want to look at my sander again for a long time, so I stopped there. Once I'm done sanding, I spend some time removing all of that wood dust from the board, starting with my vacuum. I hit it with some compressed air. And finally, I clean off any residual dust with the tack cloth. You guys ready to watch this walnut cutting board come to life? Yeah?
Ooh, yeah!
Well, let's add some finish to it then. I'm using Total Boat's Wood Honey here, which I really like for cutting board applications. This stuff is a food-safe blend of oil and wax that provides a really nice finish. Their product description on their website says it best. There are no toxic chemicals, no solvents, no metals, no VOCs, just a beautiful finish that's clean enough to eat off of. Since the goal of this video was to ditch the microplastics and introduce more clean products into my kitchen, then I feel confident in using this finish on my wooden cutting board. Now they recommend you apply 2 coats of this finish to bare wood. So I applied a liberal amount and let that finish really soak in for a while, and then came back and wiped away the excess. Once I had 1 coat covering the entire board, I just repeated that same process again for the second coat. Now they do recommend you wait 5 to 7 days before using it with food to ensure that it is cured properly. And that's it. It could not be more simple. I'll throw some feet on this board and we can call this end grain cutting board done. What do you think? Alright guys, that is a wrap on this walnut end grain cutting board. Now overall, I think this thing looks really nice. However, there are a couple of things that I would probably do differently the next time I made one. For starters, I would probably just make this thing a little bit smaller. I did make this thing a little bit chunky, as you can see, and while I think it looks awesome, I'm a little bit worried that it might be kind of heavy to haul around and have to wash. So I would probably just scale this thing down the next time I make one. Now I did plan on making this a little bit thicker because originally my plan was that I was going to need to surface this with my router to get this flat, and so I knew I'd be taking some of that dimension off. However, I was able to use my belt sander to get this thing flat, so I didn't really need to take off as much, so that just meant that it left me with a much thicker cutting board than I had originally planned, but that's okay. Still looks cool, but like I said, we'll just scale it down for the next time. Now the other thing that I would do a little bit differently next time is I would probably use some sort of darker wood glue that's designed to work with woods like walnut, because unfortunately I've got a few of my glue lines here that are visible, and because it's that lighter color that contrasts with this walnut, it just makes it to where they are very visible. It's a kind of a nitpicky thing that bugs me that I just think takes away a little bit from the cleanness of the look of this cutting board. Now I didn't do any sort of crazy design and so these lines, they kind of just stand out a little bit to me. So for the next time, I might just try to either try that darker wood glue or maybe switch up the design a little bit, maybe try something a little more challenging, and maybe those wouldn't stick out quite as bad. So those are just some of the things that I would do a little bit differently if I was to make one of these again. But I think that overall, this thing turned out to be a beautiful cutting board still, and I can finally throw away those old plastic cutting boards and add this one to our kitchen. After years of making cutting boards for other people, I finally now have one of my own, and I'm so happy about that. I guess sometimes you just have to be a little bit selfish every now and then. And hopefully this is just the first of many cutting boards that I'll be adding to our kitchen. I have an entire mountain of scrap wood left over from other projects that I need to do something with. I'll probably burn a lot of it, but some of those pieces are just too nice to burn, so I'm gonna see if I can get a couple more boards out of them. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, do me a solid and give this video a like. That's something that really helps my channel out, and I'd appreciate it. And with that, I'll be seeing you guys again soon for another video. Bye.